Hi, my name is Denver, and I'll be your tour guide today. So today I'll be giving you a tour of Greenfield, Indiana. Greenfield was founded back in 1828 and became a city in 1876. The population is currently around 20,000 people. The city has its roots in agriculture, which still holds true today, but it boomed because of oil and the industry that came as a result of that back in the late 1800s. Also, if you're wanting to follow along this virtual tour in person, you can scan the QR code or go to the link in the description to access the full walking instructions for the tour. And that QR code is right here on the screen. So the first stop on our tour, chapel and the park. The chapel and also the log jail, which we'll get to later, but you can see that poking through in the top right corner there on the back of that picture. Are both maintained by the Historical Society of Hancock County. The Historical Society researches and publishes different history about the county. So they also, however, run these buildings and also the museums that are within them. So in the basement of this building, there's actually a museum. You can tour this building and also log jail, but you'd have to schedule those beforehand by going to the Hancock History website. Now back to about the chapel here. So this building actually used to be a Methodist church, but it's from Philadelphia, which is several miles west on US 40, and that whole building was picked up and moved here in 1981. So this was quite the undertaking, as it had to be transported several miles down US 40 and right through the main street of Greenfield. So if you look in the top left, you can see they actually had to pull off the steeple and take down a whole bunch of power lines and stoplights as they moved it through Greenfield. So like I said, in the basement of this building, there's a museum, and this museum has several different collections. So one of those collections is a pioneer exhibit, and on display they've got a bunch of tools and other household items that people that founded the city would have used back in their daily lives. And there's also a display for the Civil War, because there was a militia that was formed here in Greenfield that sent men off to fight in the Civil War. So on to our next spot, which you can see peeking through the corner on this picture, like I said before, which will be the log jail. The second stop on our tour is the log jail here, which is right behind the chapel in the park. So like I previously mentioned, this building is also maintained by the Historical Society. The log jail is actually the third jail that was built here in Greenfield back in 1853. It was used until about 1871. Then the structure was bought as a private residence and stayed that way for almost a century. In the 1960s, the private residence that the jail belonged to was going to tear it down, but then decided that they would donate it to the city, and it was moved here to Riley Park as a historic structure. Inside, there are 4 rooms, and the 2 upper rooms were set up to be cells for the prisoners. You may be wondering how a wooden structure can work as a jail, when today jails are made out of concrete and steel to keep inmates inside. So this wooden structure kept prisoners inside and not digging through it in a very simple manner. There were thousands of nails driven into the logs from the inside. These nails prevented those inside from digging their way out. The nails also served a good way to reduce cost for the jail, as there was much less iron needed for those nails than if they were to build a more conventional jail. And as funny as it sounds, this actually replaced a brick building that was the second jail of Greenfield. So if you look at the picture here in the top right, you can see all the nails in one of the rooms behind this agriculture collection, and that's what all of those little dots are on the walls, are thousands of nails that have been hammered into the walls. So like I said earlier with the chapel, you can get a tour of this building. You just have to do that beforehand, and I would definitely recommend doing so. As we head to the next stop, we'll be walking beside US 40, which is known as the National Road. This was the first highway to connect the Western Territory to the East Coast. Many settlers passed along this road on their way to St. Louis and beyond. Also to note, as we walk down the hill into town is Riley Park on the right, which is a great place to come and hang out in the outdoors. If you haven't noticed already, there are a lot of things in Greenfield named after Riley, and we'll get more on that in a little bit. So now we've arrived at the next spot on our tour, the 1871 jail. So this structure was built to replace that of our last stop, the log jail. So this building currently is the prosecutor's office and actually has a tunnel which goes under the road to the courthouse on the other side of the street. So as stated, this jail was built in 1871. The architecture here was inspired by the French Second Empire. One of the most notable features of this architecture style is the roof, which starts below the third story. So this design was popular in France where buildings were taxed per story. So you would gain an extra floor above the roof line, which was untaxed. So a fun fact about this jail is that it once housed Al Bradley, who was wanted for armed robbery and murder. At the time, he was one of the FBI's most wanted men. Bradley and his two accomplices actually escaped from the jail back in 1936. Two of them were shot, and the third one was captured all the way in Maine. So this jail was actually used for just over 100 years, up until 1980. So our next spot is across the road, and if you just turn to the west, you'll see the courthouse of Greenfield, Indiana. This was the fourth courthouse of Greenfield and was built in the late 1890s and put into service in 1897. So the architecture style of the building is a Romanesque revival style. This is the same style that was used in the Riley High School. That high school has since burned, but we will pass it later on in this tour. In the cornerstone of this courthouse, there's actually a time capsule from 1896 when they had the cornerstone ceremony for this building. At the time, the courthouse had office space for all the city officials, but over the last 120 years, the space has become too small and many of the city offices have since been spread out through other buildings in the surrounding square. As we go around to the front of the building, there's actually a statue in front of the courthouse of James Whitcomb Riley. Riley was a famous poet, and after his death, the statue was made possible by many school children nationally who donated money for the erection of it. The building here is actually open for people to go inside, and I would highly recommend doing so, as inside the main lobby, you can view artwork on the ceiling that has been built into the structure. Once you're done checking out the courthouse, you can move on to the next building, which is Bradley Hall, which is adjacent to the courthouse. Formerly the Masonic Temple, this building was built in the early 1890s. At the time of its construction, it was actually the tallest building in Greenfield. This was by design, as the Freemasons are a secretive society, and they met on the upper floor of this building. So the upper floor consists of a few rooms. The first is the Masonic Hall, which is the large room, and also a smaller hall adjacent to that. The Freemasons that built this building actually ran the ceremonies for the cornerstone of the courthouse that we just visited. And the lower floors of this building were always leased out, and the building has always had several shops inside it in its 125-year history. This includes the courthouse annex, which was actually on the second floor of this building up until the early 2000s. Today there are several venues inside the historic building. These include a boutique, an art center, and coffee shop on the main level, and there's also an event hall on the upper floor. The room that is set up for a wedding here in the picture is actually formerly the Masonic Hall, which was remodeled in 2009. Bradley Hall, the event center that owns this building, does do tours, but you have to schedule those in advance via their website, but you can stroll through the art gallery during business hours without having a tour scheduled. As we walk north along State Road 9 for a block, we'll turn left before the intersection as we approach the first fire station of Greenfield. Miller's Beauty Parlor is housed in the original fire station of Greenfield. The building was built in 1895, and the building, like its nameplate describes, was also used as the city council chamber. The first level was used to store the fire equipment for the fire department. When the department was first organized, they only had one wagon with ladders that had to be drawn by hand. Once the city's waterworks were established a few years later, a second wagon with hose was purchased for use. The fire station was very important for the city, as the city had already suffered 3 large fires. Many buildings to this point were still wood-structured buildings, which left them very susceptible to fire. If you had not noticed so far, many of these buildings were built in the late 1890s. This time period for Greenfield was a time of thriving and wealth, as there was a gas boom in the area. In its height, there were over 700 gas wells in the area. This boom brought many people and industry to the area, which has left its mark on the city still to this day. Today, this building has no remnants of its former use, as can be seen by the picture on the right, but the picture on the left does show the exterior of the building when it was still being used as a fire station in the early 20th century. On our way to our next stop, we can either continue back across North Street or go back to Main Street. The North Street route will let us pass the site of the old Riley School, which burned. You can see this in the picture above. This spot is marked on the map with a star, and the only part of this building that could be salvaged was the 3 arches that can still be seen today. You can see those in the picture on the left. We are now at the boyhood home of James Whitcomb Riley. Riley is a very renowned poet from the late 19th century. He was raised here as a child in the mid-1800s. The house was also the law office of Riley's father. The house stayed in the Riley family up until it became part of the museum. The yellow house to the right is also part of the Riley Museum. Both are full of items that are from his childhood and have been preserved here. Riley is not only significant to Greenfield, but Greenfield was a major inspiration on many of Riley's works. These include poems such as Little Orphan Annie. This work was based upon a person he met here in Greenfield. Riley did not spend much of his adult life in Greenfield, even though he did own this residence, but he did come to town often to visit as he lived in nearby Indianapolis. This landmark is commonly what Greenfield is known for. The house and the museum are both open for tours, except in the winter, and the Pixie Garden in the back is also available to be checked out. Also to note, Greenfield is home to the largest 4-day festival in Indiana, Riley Days. This festival is a tribute to Riley and his impact on society, and this museum is also a centerpiece for that festival. After you're done checking out the Riley Home Museum, we'll head south and we'll pick back up at the Pensy Trail and the Greenfield Grain Elevator. The Co-op Grain Elevator here was originally built on this site in 1906. The original building did burn down, and it was reconstructed on the same spot. The grain elevator was built here specifically because of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and for the community, which was mostly comprised of farmers, this building was very important when it was built and in service. This was because farmers would sell their grain here and buy seed for their next crop. Here between the brick street and the elevator, the old depot used to stand. In this early picture, you can see behind the depot the grain elevator poking out in the top right corner. The grain elevator has also had several new constructions over the years, such as the upper section, which was added in the 1940s. Currently, it is back in the refacing stage as it was bought earlier this year. This time is not being expanded for its original purpose of holding grain, but repurposed into shops and potentially a restaurant. You cannot go inside the grain elevator, but you can take a stroll on the Pensy Trail, which takes you back to where we began. The Pensy Trail is where the Pennsylvania Railroad went through Greenfield. After the 1970s, the tracks were no longer used, and eventually the city converted just over 5 miles of track into a multi-purpose trail. For residents, this is a great way for a dog to be walked or to get a workout by going for a jog. That would be the end of this tour of Greenfield, Indiana, and now you can follow the Pensy Trail back to Morristown Pike and go back to where you started off. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of Greenfield, Indiana. Feel free to check out my sources for pictures and information on the history of Greenfield.